All right, we're almost ready to start. Go ahead and turn in your Bibles to the book of James in the New Testament. We'll look at the book of James. That's what we're going to do for the next few weeks. And if you ask people their favorite book in the Bible, there's some that never get there. Ezekiel is hardly ever mentioned. Some others are hardly ever mentioned. Sometimes people say Revelation. Sometimes people will say Proverbs. Never heard anybody say Song of Solomon. But James in the New Testament is oftentimes at least in your top three. And it's one of those books we just absolutely love. It excites us. And there's a lot of joy that comes from the study of the book of James. I'm working on my 12th year here. This will be the third time that I've gone through the book of James in the auditorium class. So there we are, once every 4 years. So I probably have taught this book more than I've taught any other book in the time that I've been here. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I was looking through my notes and stuff and noticed that. So James is just one of those books that it just speaks to us in a special way. Now, as you look through our notes, what you're going to see is an argument which you oftentimes hear about the Bible. In fact, I had someone say this to me just about 2 months ago. We were talking about God and Bible and Christianity and the importance of getting right with God. And I was talking to this person. This person said, "You realize the Bible's 2,000 years old?" And I thought to myself, duh, but don't say duh. You're just like, really? And he said, 2,000 years old. They said, I don't even listen to music from the 80s. And you're talking about a 2,000-year-old book. And it's true. Peter, Paul, and Moses, they never had to worry about the price of gasoline, right? Peter, Paul, and Moses were never worried about internet access, about the Facebook account or Snapchat. They never had to worry about Democrats or Republicans. A lot of the things that we deal with every single day would be absolute foreign to the people we read of in the Bible. James, if you were to transport him from the first century to today, his mind would be blown, wouldn't it? But the things that he dealt with speak to us today. It doesn't matter what country you're in. It doesn't matter what year you live in. There's a universal outlook for every one of us. And let's talk about some of the subjects that you're going to read of in the book of James. James chapter 1, 2 through 8. Consider it pure joy whenever you face fears and trials of many kinds. In other words, he's talking about suffering. God, why do you let this happen to me? God, why are you letting this country just go to the garbage, it seems? Why am I hurting here? Why is this happening to me? That's what James is about. James speaks to our suffering, to our hurt. Prejudice, okay? Chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. For him, it's primarily the rich and the poor, Jew and Gentile. We live in a country that has prejudice, and I think we are working our way past it, but oftentimes it rears its ugly head. And in our country, oftentimes we look at it from a black-white issue, but there is rich versus poor, the class envy which is there. There is the native people, people who grew up in Marshall County, those who have moved here. There's prejudice as far as those who are educated and those who are not educated. In so many ways, you have that happen. James says, hey, listen, this is how we handle prejudice. This is how prejudice needs to be dealt with in the church. Chapter 2, 14 through 26, faith. What does it mean to be a Christian? Do you live by faith alone, or does faith have to have works? Is being a Christian just showing up at church, or is Christianity really about what happens in every day that ends with Y? Every day of the week. It's pretty relevant. Chapter 3, 1 through 12. Let those who teach be very careful because they're going to be under a tougher judgment, right? The tongue, what you say and how you say it. How do I look in this dress? Okay, hopefully that's a question you'll never hear from me. But, if your wife or your girlfriend or your daughter or your mother says, how do I look in this dress? All right. Should you tell the truth? Yes. But sometimes you should be careful how you tell the truth, right? Now, when we greet one another, when we talk to one another, when we go through life, it's important that we understand what to say and how to say it. That will make your life much better, increase the quality of your life greatly when you figure that out. Wisdom. Pure wisdom comes from above. How do you handle life? What is the secret to life? How do you handle situations as they arise? That just speaks right to today. Chapter 4, 1 through 10, conflict management. What do you do when somebody's angry with you? What do you do when you're supposed to forgive somebody but you just don't want to? What do you do when you're burning up with anger? That's pretty relevant right there, isn't it? The uncertainty of life. We believe that everybody is mortal but us. Life is a vapor. We go around and we say we're going to do this today, we're going to do that tomorrow. We don't even know if tomorrow's really coming for us. The uncertainty of life. It's pretty relevant, isn't it? Materialism. Are we more than our stuff? Are we more than just our things? Patience for Christ's return and getting ready. Are you ready for the return of the Lord? As Sam would have said earlier, do you have spiritual insurance? Chapter 5, 13 through 18, the fervent, effective prayer of a righteous man avails much. How do you pray? And do you pray properly? Does your prayer life show that you trust God? And how do you treat the neighbor? How do you treat your neighbor? How do you treat those who are different? How do you treat those who are similar? How do you treat those who need a little extra effort? Now, you go through all that, and that's kind of a quick outline going through the book. There's a lot more in there. But I think the reason James speaks to us, it's only 108 verses, I think the reason it speaks to us is just its absolute relevance. As you go through that list, every one of those is a modern topic. Every one of those is something that we're oftentimes struggling with. And we actually do need to take a break during the week to think about this, to work on this, to concentrate on. It's an important thing to see there. And so a lot of that is important for us to know and to notice and to recognize. So it's relevant. Written 1,000 years or 2,000 years ago, but man, it's relevant even today. All right, so let's meet the guy who wrote the book. This is James. That picture is from a Greek Orthodox church in Nashville, Tennessee. It's a copy of an ancient drawing which somebody thought James looked like in the 5th century. So 500 years after the guy was living, they thought, man, we're going to call this guy and give him a cool beard. All right? So they painted him up there. And that picture is as good as any other picture, I suppose. It's drawn by a person from the Middle Eastern background. And so, he's not white, he's not black. He's kind of that Middle Eastern look to him. You'll notice, if you care about this, that top right, the Greek, if you transliterate, it's Jacobus, which this is Bible nerdiness, okay? The word James in Greek is Jacobus. That Y is actually a J, so it's Jacobus. If it wasn't for Jerome translating the Bible into Latin, we would call James Jacob, because that's his name, is Jacob. But because the Bible is translated into Latin before it came over into King James to us today, he's James. Probably when you get to heaven, you can call him James or Jacob. He'll answer. I mean, he's been hearing it for eternity, so he'll be all right with it. But that's something to notice. When you look at the family of Jesus, you have Jesus. His Hebrew name really is Joshua. That's what Yeshua means, Joshua. He's got a brother named Jude, or he would call him Judah. And then he has a brother named James, which he would call Jacob. So there's a very Jewishness coming out of Mary and Joseph, which is not surprising at all. But that's just one of those things which I didn't realize until, I guess, maybe my second year of Greek, that the guy's name was actually Jacob when I went across. But that's one of those things that really makes no difference. But I thought it was neat, and I like to talk about it. All right. So who is James? If you meet James, who is it that we're talking about? If he were to sit down and introduce himself and say, hey, James, let's hear your life story. Let's talk to James. Go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 13 and verse 55. And we'll go through these fairly quickly. We see here that he is the brother of Jesus, okay? People are arguing about who Jesus is, and they're like, you can't be famous because you're from here, from Nazareth. And so they say to Jesus, is this not the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother Mary? Aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? There you go. There you see James listed out right there. So he's a brother. Now, there's some people who have a doctrine of the perpetual virginity of Mary. That doctrine's not found in the Bible. But people trying to find that doctrine have said Joseph had another wife, and so that other wife had all these children. Other people have said, well, maybe these are nephews or cousins of Jesus. These are brothers. Mary had children after Jesus was born. Jesus was born of a virgin birth, but afterwards there were at least these children who were born. And so James is the firstborn after Jesus. Okay? So you see that there. Now turn to John 7. And in John 7, we see a little bit of sarcasm from the brothers. Jesus is headed up on a Passover. There's 4 Passovers in the book of John. And he's headed up on a Passover, and so, or Feast of Tabernacles. And so as he's getting ready to go, look there in verse 3 of John 7. His brothers say to him, depart from here and go to Judea, that your disciples may see the works that you're doing. No one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. Verse 5, for even his brothers did not believe in him. And of course, Jesus says, all things are in my time. I'm not going to be told what to do by anybody. I'm not going to be bossed around, especially by sarcastic brothers. But what you see here are the brothers of Jesus did not believe in Jesus. And so Jesus can relate to a lot of us in the church who have family members who are not believers, who are not Christian, who think it's silly for us to have the faith that we have. A lot of times when you think about Jesus, you think, hey, he's the perfect Son of God, he's a great rabbi, has all these apostles. There are a lot of people close to Jesus who did not believe. And that brings us to our next point. Run over to 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15, as Paul is talking about the resurrection, what we see in this passage, look in verse 15. Chapter 15, let's look at verse 3 of 1 Corinthians. For I delivered to you, first of all, that which I received from Christ, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He rose again on the 3rd day, according to the Scriptures. He was seen by Cephas, as Peter, and the 12. After that, he was seen by 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present. Some have fallen asleep. After that, he was seen by, see in verse 7, seen by James, and then all the apostles. And of course, verse 8, last of all, Paul says he was seen by me. I think that's interesting. When Jesus is resurrected, who does he go see? Well, yes, he sees the apostles. He sees a lot of people in Galilee as he's going down there. Why is he going to Galilee? He's going to see his brother. And I think it's interesting, Jesus spent time after his resurrection going back to his family and doing what he could to convert those who are closest to him. And I think that's something we don't bring out very often. But Jesus had an unbelieving family, and one of his priorities after his resurrection was to chase down that family and show him himself, his resurrected self. And so his family obeyed. We know that Jude obeyed because Jude's going to write a book, and we know that James obeyed as well because he wrote a book also. It looks like all the brothers obeyed. And so we see that conversion which happens in chapter 1 of Acts, verses 13 and 14. We see them there in the upper room. And in chapter 12 and verse 17, when Peter is led out of prison by the angel, What does he do? He sends word to James. He makes sure that James knows what's happened. When Paul comes to Jerusalem after his conversion, he spent that time in Arabia. When he comes to Jerusalem, the very first person he goes to see is James. That's Galatians 1 and verse 19. And on the third missionary journey, the very first person that Paul comes to see is James. That's Acts 21 and verse 8. James was an unbeliever, but James was present at the day of Pentecost, and James was very active in the church there in Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, Galatians 2 and verse 9, when Paul is talking about coming back and Peter not behaving the way he should, Paul says that his apostleship is equal to any of the others, and he says he's equal to the pillars of the church, Galatians 2:9. Now, why that matters to us, who are the pillars of the church? These are the leaders of the church in Jerusalem: James, Peter, and John. And so James is a leader in the church there in Jerusalem. He's one of those guys who is very prominent in the church. And so when Paul returns from his second missionary journey, the Jewish brethren are chasing after him, and there is a huge controversy about whether or not Gentiles can obey the gospel. Who speaks up? Paul speaks up, Peter speaks up, and James speaks up. Now, Paul, of course, apostles of the Gentiles. Peter is the one who preached the very first sermon to the Jews in Acts 2 and preached the very first sermon to the Gentiles in Acts 10. And James seems to be a leader of the Jewish church there in Jerusalem, primarily Jewish people. And so that whole spectrum is covered. James is considered a pillar of the church, and he also speaks up in the Jerusalem conference. Now, of course, he has a brother named Jude. Jude calls himself the brother of James, and you're going to see there a little bit of off-subject stuff here. There's a guy named Eusebius, and he is a disciple of John. He lives in the 2nd century, or later, even, in fact. And he talks about this historian named Hyrcanus who talks about James. So this is secondhand knowledge. But you've heard it quite a bit if you've read F.F. Bruce's commentary and some people who have copied him as well. James is known as camel knees. All right? Not exactly what you want to call somebody, is it? But James was famous, according to Hyrcanus and Eusebius, because every day he would go into the temple, and he would go into the temple, fall on his knees, and he would pray for the redemption of the nation of Israel. He would pray that all of Israel would come to know Jesus and would repent of their sins and become a part of the church. And he did that every day for hours and hours. And in fact, he did it so much that they say there were calluses that would grow on his knees because he just stayed on his knees so often. You know how if you work out in the field, you grow a callus. You know, if you're at work and you work with your hands, you develop calluses and things such as that. His knees had calluses because he was always on his knees. In 63 A.D., tradition tells us that James was martyred or murdered because of his faith. He was taken to the very top of the temple and thrown down, and it paralyzed him, and they beat him to death with clubs. Jerusalem was a rough place to live at that time, about 63, because in 65, that's the middle of the Jewish revolt. 65, Vespasian and Titus came and would destroy the city of Jerusalem over the next 5 years. And so there near the end of the time of Jerusalem, James is put to death. So that's a little bit of your history of what you're working with when you think about James. You're thinking about a man who, when he knew Jesus, saw Jesus, took him for granted, didn't really listen to him, didn't really like him. Very likely he was there for the Sermon on the Mount because he kind of quotes it in the book of James. We'll look at that here in a few minutes. But he's a guy who, when he believed, he gave it his all. And he is known as James the Just, according to Eusebius, because he spends so much time with the poor, with the outcast, with those who are struggling. He was one of those guys who really wanted to take care of people who were in a rough way. And you're going to notice that in the tone of the book. It's going to come through a lot as you look at these things. Now, the book is written from a Jewish perspective. There's a lot of Jewish words, and that's a little bit more nerdy than we want to get right here. But Lord God Almighty, which he uses twice, is a very Jewish term from the Old Testament. And there's a lot of quotations out of Proverbs and a lot of quotations out of other books that are found throughout here. It could be, James could be the very first New Testament book written. very likely it is up there as far as being the first. The ones who would compete with it would be 1 Thessalonians, which is the first book written by Paul, maybe Galatians. But as far as the general epistles and maybe the entire New Testament, James is your very first New Testament book, which makes sense because it's about practical Christian living. Not a ton of doctrine in here, but this is how a Christian lives, this is what a Christian does, and this is how you go. So, we see James, a bondservant of Christ, in James 1:1, and of the Lord Jesus Christ, or bondservant of God and Lord Jesus Christ. Now, if you look at James 1:1, mine says to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. This word in some English translations is the diaspora, and that is a magical word for the Jewish people. What does diaspora mean? It means to be scattered. Dia means width. You got diameter, right? It means to go everywhere. Spora, if you're, thinking about mold, which hopefully you're not right now, but you're thinking about those spores and things, you're thinking about growth. And so the diaspora is where people have been scattered to the four corners of the earth, and yet they grow, and yet they remain as a certain people. When the northern nation of Israel was destroyed by Assyria, the Assyrians' way of stopping rebellion is they would take people in groups of hundreds and plant them in different places. And their thought was, if you went somewhere where nobody knew your language, nobody knew your culture, nobody knew how, who you were, then you're going to lose who you are because you're going to copy everybody around. You're not going to rebel. You're not going to want to go back, especially your children and your grandchildren. They're going to like where they are. And so it breaks the back of a nation politically if you scatter them everywhere. The southern nation kind of had that happen also with Babylon and Persia. Babylon allowed them to come back, or Persia did. Most of them didn't. So by the first century, 70% of all Jews lived outside of Israel. Now we think, wow, that's a big deal. That's kind of crazy. But start thinking about the implications of that. You know how Jesus so often in his parables will say, a landowner, told his servants to do this in his field, or he sent his servant back. That's because of the diaspora. What happened was land ownership in Israel went by heritage, ancestry. And so a person could be living in Italy, and they would still own an acre of land outside of Jerusalem. A person could be living in Turkey, and they still owned a certain section of land. They may have never seen it. They may have never been there, but they owned it. And so they would hire servants. You would hire people who would work that land. And so that kind of made the nation really interesting when you're starting to try to figure out where money goes and everything else. What matters to us more so than just that is worship. The Jews were required to go to Jerusalem 4 times every year. All right, if you live on the other side of the Roman Empire, if you live over in Babylon, you can't afford to go to the temple 4 times a year. You can send an offering, you can send a sacrifice, but it's hard to do it. And so because of that, they began to make synagogues. That happened about the 2nd century BC. And a synagogue is where if 10 men lived in a city, they would get together and build a building, and on Saturday they'd read the law, but every day of the week the folks would be there. Now, think about being a pilgrim, being a diaspora. Maybe for us, the closest thing would be, Mennonite or Amish. Does anybody ever travel where the Mennonites or Amish are? Sometimes we like their crafts. Sometimes we like their vegetables. Sometimes we notice them going down the road in a horse and buggy. Have you seen that? Okay. That's what the Jews were like. They were people who were away from Israel. They looked unusual. These guys would not eat pork. These guys would circumcise. These guys would dress differently. Their hair would be different. They were very different. And so they would retain their culture even though they were in Alexandria, or even though they're in Corinth, or even though they're in Philippi. They would retain their nationality, but they were away. Now, that's the providence of God, because Paul would travel, and I've called it before several times, God's toolkit to start a church. Paul would show up in a synagogue and begin preaching using the Old Testament text, saying that Jesus is the Christ, and he would start the church there, They would kick him out of the synagogue because he realized he wasn't really preaching the Jewish faith. And so then he would bring Gentiles in. And that's how he started churches in all these cities. But it also, being in synagogues, made the reading of Scripture a whole lot more important because that was the connection you had back to God. And so when James begins writing, he's writing to the diaspora, the 12 tribes of Israel. But it's not just the Jews, it's the church. Acts chapter 8. Right? We see Stephen put to death, and when he's put to death, it makes the people in Jerusalem go wild. They start killing Christians everywhere. It worked for Stephen, they're going to kill them all. And so Christians are scattered everywhere throughout the earth, especially outside of Jerusalem. There they go. And so they go everywhere preaching the word. There's your diaspora. There are not many Christians left in Jerusalem because they're traveling. You go to Acts 12, James is put to death, not the author of this book, but the apostle. Peter is thrown in prison. It is hard to be a Christian in Jerusalem. But they're scattered. There may be a few just outside the city limits. There may be a few up in Antioch. There may be a few further this way or that way. But they're scattered. But they're keeping the faith, and they're all over the earth, and they're still identified by who they are. And so that's what we're going to see as we begin reading through and noticing. That's who James writes this letter to. James is still in Jerusalem, and he will die eventually. But he's still in Jerusalem, and he's saying, I know that you've run away. I know that you've left, but I want you to know you're still Christian. I want you to know this is still how you live, even in the midst of persecution, even in the midst of tough times, even when it seems that the world is not going the way it should. All right. This next one, thankfully Danny fixed for me. I have forgotten because we've had 13 weeks of speakers. When you put a chart on a keynote, the chart does not remain. It becomes a diaspora. It goes everywhere. And so this one went everywhere. And, Danny was like, I think I fixed it. And it probably looks better than it did. So thanks, Danny. Good job. Good job. All right. James chapter 1 talks about being patient. Chapter 2 talks about faith and works, being practicing. Chapter 3 talks about treating one another well, especially with our tongue. So I've used the word polite because preachers have to alliterate everything. Chapter 4, priorities. Your life is a vapor. Chapter 5, be prayerful. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. If you're wanting to outline the book of James, remember how James goes, that's where you go. James absolutely destroys hypocrisy, and you'll notice that. And the key text, James chapter 1, verse 27, pure and undefiled religion. What is it? Even if you're kicked out of Jerusalem and you're away from the temple, pure and undefiled religion is this: to keep oneself unspotted from the world and to care for widows and orphans in their distress. If you want to boil down Christianity, what you need to look like Monday through Wednesday, what does it mean to be a Christian? You realize you are not in the world. You're in the world, but not of the world. And you take care of other people, especially marginalized groups. That is something so very important. Okay, now James, as you go through here, we're going to see it's the Proverbs of the New Testament. That's why a lot of people will title it. Very simple language. And for a few minutes here, stay here in James with one finger and go to Matthew 5 with your other finger. Now, if you have an electronic device, I guess you can just hit the back button. I don't know. I'm too old for that. But let's go back and forth because I want you to notice James may not have been a believer during the Sermon on the Mount, but he sure heard it, or at least he knew what was preached at the Sermon on the Mount. And so we're going to hang out, and I want us to notice some of these similarities. Okay, look at chapter 5, verse 3. Blessed are the poor, this is Matthew. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Okay? Now look over in James chapter 2, verse 5. Okay? Listen, my beloved brethren, has not God chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? See the parallel there? It's kind of interesting. All right, go back to Matthew again. Let's look in chapter 7. Look at verses 15 through 20. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they're ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and is thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruit you will know them. Now turn to James chapter 3 and look at verse 10. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus no spring yields both fresh water and salt water. You see the similarities going there? Okay. Now, let's look at Matthew chapter 5 and verse 9, back to the Beatitudes. Matthew 5:9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Okay, now James chapter 3 and verse 18. James 3:18. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. All right. Now Matthew chapter 5. Let's look at verses. Let's see. What verses do I want to look up? I'm doing a lot of this by memory, and that's not good. I'm looking at James 5, 2 and 3. That's what I'm wanting. Is it? Or am I looking at... Yeah, let's look at Matthew 6, 19 and 20. That's what I'm doing. I'm transliterating it in my head. Okay, Matthew 6, 19 and 20. Don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. All right, so as you see that, now let's go over to Matthew 5, 2 and 3, or James 5, 2 and 3. James 5, verse 2, your riches are corrupted, your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver are corroded, their corrosion will be a witness against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasures on the last day. All right, now I've got about 6 more of those, but we're going to just hold off on that because you see what's going on here. James is a retelling of the Sermon on the Mount for Christians. And so it's kind of interesting. Sometimes perhaps you've noticed that if you look through and go with it, but James really loves the Sermon on the Mount, and he's really giving it to us and showing us how that works. So this is my last slide that I want us to notice here. Because we have covered James many, many times. I talk about covering it a lot of times in classes I teach. But you covered it in other classes, and you hear a lot of sermons about the book of James. So here we are with 108 verses. Why cover it again? Why is this so important? Why does this matter? Well, it matters because the Word of God changes us. It transforms you. N.B. Hardeman, old preacher, way back there, okay? One of the guys who helped start Freed Hardeman, one of the guys who helped start Memphis School of Preaching. He had a saying, it's interesting. He said, every 5 years, you're preaching at a new church. First time I heard that, I thought, man, I hope I don't get fired that often. He says, no, it's not about being fired. Every 5 years, you're preaching at a new church. Because there's a lot of people who have passed away. There's a lot of people who have just disappeared. There's a lot of people who are new. And there's a lot of people who are still there, but you're not the same person you were 5 years ago. And so sometimes, especially as preachers, we think, man, I've already preached that sermon, or man, we've already gone through that book. Well, look in the church directory. We're not the same church we were 10 years ago. We're not the same church we were 5 years ago. We're certainly not the same church we were before the pandemic. And so it's important to go through these books, these fundamentals, because the Bible transforms who we are. Something that spoke to you and changed you 5 years ago, this year, when you study it, it's going to be something different that speaks to you, some different experience that you're going to have, and some different way that you're going to grow. But the way that that's going to happen, the way that this book is going to matter in our study, is that you think about what we've done. You make it then more than just the 30 minutes which we've shared together this morning or this evening. Think about it through the week. Read the book. It's 108 verses. You can pull this off. Joking about it, 3 verses a day, you get through it in a month. I hope you do more than 3 verses a day. But work your way through this book. I thought about, and I didn't hold to it, but it crossed my mind, and I played with it in my head for a good while. Lads leaders, they have centurion of Scripture. I thought about maybe as a church, memorize either the book of Colossians or the book of James. Because 108 verses gets you pretty close to 100, doesn't it? A little over. Well, I'm not doing it as a church. But read this book. Let God speak to you. Let God transform who you are and help you to be who you should be. Now, second thing, this is not rocket science. Now, some of the tangents I go on sometimes may sound complicated. You know, Jacobus, Jacob, James and Jacob are the same name. There's some details every once in a while pop up that, you wouldn't know unless you studied Greek or studied something else. James, simplistic. It's not rocket science. It is a simple way of life, but man, you're going to stick out if you follow it. Now, I talked about before, some people say, man, this is an old book, 2,000 years old. In the world of chaos, in a world that thinks it's new and they've discovered everything in the last 2 or 3 years, they haven't. It's just the same thing over and over. There's nothing new under the sun. In a world of chaos, be a simple Christian. Nothing more, nothing less. Watch your tongue. Realize that your life is just a vapor. Realize that these sufferings that you're going through make you a better person, make you closer to God. Be a person who cares for your neighbor. Work to be simple in that world of chaos.